Sorry, this floor's for executives only. Admin staff wait downstairs. That's what they told her. No questions asked. No hesitation. Just looked at her skin, her face, and decided she didn't belong. Never mind the tailored suit. Never mind the portfolio in her hand. Never mind that she wasn't there to apply for a job. She was there to buy the company. But they didn't see any of that. Because when a black woman walks into a room built by old money and older minds, the first assumption is always the same. She must have lost her way. This is not just another underdog story. It's the moment humiliation collided with strategy. And by the time they figured out who she was, it was already too late. What would you have done? Spoke up? Walked out? Or stayed silent long enough to own the building? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe some power doesn't need to shout to be heard, hit like and subscribe. We're just getting started. Angela Williams stepped off the downtown express train with a calm precision that belied the whirlwind of emotions beneath her tailored navy blazer. Her heels clicked in rhythm against the polished marble floor of the high-rise lobby as she walked past chrome fixtures and glass walls that mirrored the crisp morning skyline of Atlanta. The towering silhouette of Braylock & Moore, a global financial consultancy known as much for its prestige as for its unspoken exclusivity, loomed above her like a gatekeeper to a world only a chosen few were ever allowed to enter. Clutching a leather-bound portfolio and a resume that boasted summa cum laude from Howard, an MBA from Stanford, and 3 years of executive leadership in a top-tier fintech startup, Angela had every reason to feel confident. But her heart pounded in a familiar pattern. Not from fear, she'd long since made peace with discomfort, but from anticipation, from knowing that brilliance alone had never been enough. Not in rooms like these. Not when you looked like her. The receptionist, a young woman with bone-straight blonde hair and a practiced smile, barely glanced up before offering a curt name, Angela Williams. Here for the VP of Strategy interview at 9 a.m., Angela replied, keeping her tone even. The woman's eyes flicked up for a beat too long. You're with facilities? She asked, her voice floating with that brand of casual bias that wore pearls and never raised its tone. Angela smiled politely, unfazed. No. Strategy. With Mr. Lawrence. Oh, the woman said, blinking, then hastily typed something into the computer. Right. Please have a seat. Angela nodded and turned toward the pristine waiting area, where muted tones and minimalist design whispered money. She sat between 2 men, one white, one Asian, both dressed in tailored suits, both visibly older. One gave her a polite nod. The other didn't look up from his phone. As the minutes passed, Angela reviewed her pitch deck, rehearsing her answers, breathing deep. She was ready. What she wasn't ready for was the group of junior analysts walking past the glass wall just behind the lobby desk. They weren't trying to be quiet, not really. They called that girl for the VP round, one whispered, but loud enough to be heard. Another snickered. They gotta be filling a diversity quota or something. No way she's on the short list. Angela didn't flinch. Instead, she looked up and locked eyes with one of them through the glass, her gaze unbothered, precise. He blinked and turned away. At 9:07, a tall man in a tailored gray suit approached, clipboard in hand. Angela Williams? She stood. Yes. He extended a hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thomas, I'll be leading you upstairs. Mr. Lawrence and the panel are ready. Let's get started. The elevator ride was silent, though she felt Thomas glance at her reflection in the mirror like surface once or twice, curiosity dancing just behind his professional mask. On the 41st floor, the doors opened to a conference room where 3 men and 1 woman sat waiting. All white, all in their 40s or 50s. Their smiles were controlled, their energy crisp until they saw her. It was subtle, just a shift in posture, a brief exchange of looks. Angela had seen it before. She walked in with grace, greeted each of them with a firm handshake and eye contact. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to share how I believe I can elevate Braylock's strategy for the next decade. As she sat, one of the board members, a man named Gregory with silver temples and a Mont Blanc pen clipped to his lapel, leaned forward. "So Angela, quite the resume," he said. "But tell me, how does someone from a background like yours break into this world?" Angela kept her expression neutral. "If you mean a background of financial rigor, creative strategy, and measurable results, I'd say it started in my sophomore year," he interrupted with a chuckle, waving a hand. No, I meant more personal. Where did you grow up again?" "Baltimore," she said evenly. "Ah." He nodded, as if something had just been confirmed. For the next 20 minutes, the interview played like a piano with missing keys. Every time Angela struck a strong note, revenue growth projections, digital transformation strategies, cost-saving initiatives, it was met with a smile that said cute or a nod that meant, "You're lucky to be here." The only woman on the panel, Meredith, asked pointedly, "Do you have experience leading in environments as high pressure as this one?" Angela replied without hesitation, "I've led multi-million-dollar restructures and spearheaded international expansions. My environments have always been high pressure, Meredith." She smiled slightly, letting the answer land with weight. But by the end, the energy in the room had shifted. Not because of her performance, it was razor sharp, but because the decision had clearly already been made. As Thomas escorted her out, she overheard one of the board members mutter under his breath, "She's impressive, but not really our image, is she?" And just like that, Angela knew. The interview had never been about qualifications. It was about how well she fit into a mold that was never designed for her in the first place. Back in the elevator, Thomas offered a tight smile. "Best of luck. We'll be in touch." Angela returned the smile. "I'm sure you will." As the doors closed, she didn't let the sadness come. Instead, she pulled out her phone and sent a single message. They laughed. Within seconds, a reply pinged back. "Then it begins." Angela hadn't even reached the building's revolving doors before she received the automated thank you email from Braylock & Moore, the subject line reading, "We appreciate your time," as if her presence had been nothing more than a formality. She didn't need the email to know it was over, but its timing, so immediate, so dismissive, clanged like a final insult echoing down the corridors she had just walked through. As she passed the brass-finished elevators, her phone buzzed again, but she didn't look. She needed air, not alerts. Still, her exit hadn't come without friction, and her final moments in the interview room had taken a sharp turn from coded disrespect to outright belittlement, a descent she hadn't anticipated happening so fast. It had started the moment she answered a question about corporate rebranding strategies. Angela had laid out a comprehensive, data-backed case study involving a fintech firm that went from Series A to acquisition under her strategic leadership, and for a moment, the panel looked genuinely surprised. But surprise quickly curdled into scrutiny. Gregory, the silver-templed board member who had fixated on her upbringing, leaned back in his chair and squinted as if examining a riddle, then said, "That's quite the initiative. Did you lead those efforts independently, or were you assisting someone?" The implication wasn't subtle. Angela raised her eyebrows slightly. "I was the executive lead. The strategy and execution were both under my directive." Meredith, the only woman in the room, crossed her arms and said, "I'm curious, Angela. Who taught you to speak like that? I mean, your tone is certainly unique." Angela blinked. "Unique how?" she asked evenly. "It's not what we're used to in this boardroom," Meredith replied, her words laced with passive critique. "It feels more motivational speaker than executive." One of the men coughed into his fist, clearly trying to hide a smirk. The energy in the room had shifted again, not into silence, but into a strange, collective boldness, as if they no longer needed to pretend. That's when David, the youngest panelist, maybe mid-30s and wearing an overly tight pinstripe suit, chuckled and gestured toward her blazer. "You know," he said, not looking at her directly, "there's something bold about that outfit. Not what I expected for an executive role, but bold." Angela glanced down at her attire, crisp, professional, tailored navy, nothing out of line. But in this room, worn by this woman, it became a canvas for subtle aggression. She straightened her spine. "I dress for leadership, not approval," she replied, voice cool. David leaned back and said with faux amusement, "You sure you weren't headed to the PR floor? Or HR maybe? This is the strategy suite. We like our execs a little more." Wall Street, a little less TED Talk. A low chuckle moved through the panel. Angela didn't respond immediately. She let the moment breathe, let the silence hover like a sword, and then spoke with clarity. You invited me into this room based on credentials that took over a decade to build. What part of them suggests I can't think strategically? Gregory shrugged. No one's saying that, Angela. Let's not get defensive. We're just making sure you understand our culture here. It's specific. The conversation derailed from there. They questioned her leadership style as too inclusive, bordering on idealistic. They claimed her market projections were ambitious, but maybe unrealistic for someone who's never led at this scale, despite clear documentation proving otherwise. Then, in what felt like the most deliberate cut, Meredith asked, out of curiosity, when you first walked in, did you happen to stop at the 12th floor? That's where facilities and admin usually check in. Angela, understanding the jab, smiled tightly. No, I knew exactly where I was going. Meredith smiled back. Just checking. The room didn't laugh. It didn't need to. The disdain was palpable. The hour dragged on, not as an interview, but as a public stress test wrapped in condescension. They asked questions only to interrupt the answers. They faked interest only to turn it into amusement. They wanted to see how far she could be pushed without snapping. And when the final question was asked, if she could name 3 things she admired about Braylock's culture, Angela stood. I think I've seen enough of it today to answer that honestly, she said, offering a professional smile that concealed the controlled fire behind her eyes. Thank you for your time. She shook their hands, each colder than the last, and walked out with grace they did not deserve. But behind her, as the door shut, they didn't even wait for the elevator to reach the lobby before the mask slipped off completely. In the conference room, Gregory laughed. Well, he said, loosening his tie. She's got grit, I'll give her that. Shame we can't put that on the company website. David chuckled. She should try customer relations. She'd kill it in call centers, especially with that professional tone of hers. Meredith grinned. Maybe she could be a keynote speaker for Diversity Day. Even Thomas, who had escorted her up, cracked a grin. Y'all are terrible, he said, chuckling, but didn't correct them, didn't defend her, didn't say a word. Outside, the sun was still climbing the glassy skyline, casting reflections of opulence across a city that still judged books by covers they claimed not to see. Angela stood beneath the marble awning of Braylock and Moore, inhaling deeply. Around her, executives rushed to meetings, interns clutched iced coffees, and luxury cars glided past in silence. She opened her phone and typed another message. They think it's over. Let's begin. The reply came in seconds. Confirmation received. All green. Exactly 7 days after Angela walked out of Braylock and Moore's glass tower with her dignity intact and their ignorance fully exposed, a confidential email landed in the inbox of Harold Lawrence, the firm's managing director. The subject line read, Acquisition Interest Confidential Proposal Attached, and it came from an encrypted investment entity named Altera Capital Partners. The message was brief, precise, and undeniably provocative. We are interested in purchasing a 51% controlling stake in Braylock and Moore. Our portfolio managers have reviewed your Q4 earnings and believe strategic restructuring under new leadership could yield exponential growth. We are willing to negotiate favorable terms for a full executive buy-in. Let us know your availability for an introductory meeting. Harold read the message twice, then a third time, each repetition sharpening the gleam in his eyes. This wasn't just capital. It was transformation. No one, especially not in the current climate, made a move for controlling interest without a vision. And a company like Altera, known for sweeping turnarounds and turning floundering firms into case studies, wasn't in the business of throwing darts. They made offers when they meant to win. Within the hour, Harold had called an emergency meeting with the board. At 10 a.m. sharp, 6 executives gathered in the top-floor conference room where just a week prior they had dismissed Angela with such arrogant ease. Now, that very room hummed with speculation and barely contained ambition. Altera's interest is massive, Harold said, gesturing to the printed proposal on the table. This isn't a casual investment. They want control. They want vision. And if we play this right, they'll bring capital, press, and maybe even the partnerships we've been chasing for years. Gregory leaned forward, flipping through the pages. They must have seen something impressive in our last report. Or maybe the merger rumor with Easton and company sparked buzz. Meredith, cool as ever, nodded. Whatever it is, we don't let this get away. If we bring in new capital and ride that PR wave, it erases the hit we took after the Rothman fallout. David tapped his Mont Blanc pen against his notepad. We host them. Red carpet. Full tour. Lay it on thick. Make them see we're worth the buyout. No one asked the obvious question. Why Altera would want controlling power over a firm that had just plateaued in growth for 3 quarters. No one questioned the curious timing. Instead, they assembled a welcoming committee, drafted a schedule, prepped the PR team. And by the following Monday, the firm was ready. Harold personally wrote the agenda. They would begin with a welcome brunch in the rooftop lounge, followed by a presentation in the strategy suite, then end with a private negotiation session in the same conference room where Angela had been dissected like a case study in mediocrity. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly know, was that every step of this orchestration had been engineered by Angela herself. Altera Capital Partners wasn't just any firm. It was hers. Born from years of silent investment work, cryptocurrency arbitrage, and a tight circle of trusted advisors who had followed her through every betrayal, every underestimation, every door closed in her face. She'd build it quietly, without noise, because power doesn't need applause when it holds a pen. Angela had watched Braylock and Moore's dismissal of her not as a defeat, but as a confirmation of everything she already knew about the rot in their so-called legacy. And she had waited, not for justice, but for leverage. Now she had it. When the morning of the meeting arrived, the building buzzed with nervous energy. White-gloved service staff arranged imported pastries and monogrammed cappuccino cups on silver trays. HR prepped talking points in case any of the Altera reps asked about corporate diversity. The front desk was told to expect 2 limousines and to direct the delegation to the executive elevator. Harold straightened his lapels in the mirror, breathing deeply before taking the elevator up to the reception suite. Meredith checked her lipstick 3 times. David rehearsed his opening pitch in the restroom mirror. Even Gregory, usually smug and unreadable, was uncharacteristically alert. As the clock struck 9 o'clock, the receptionist stood as the double doors swung open, and in walked 3 people dressed in minimalist black suits. 2 men, 1 woman. The woman's stride was confident but unhurried. Her presence absorbed the room's oxygen like gravity. Angela Williams didn't need to smile. She didn't need to speak. The silence her presence triggered said more than any introduction could. She wore a soft charcoal suit, tailored to perfection. No jewelry save for a slim watch, and her natural curls framed her face with sharp elegance. The receptionist blinked, unsure. "Can I help you?" Angela nodded once. "Altera, we're here for the meeting." The woman hesitated, still stunned. "Why, you're the representative?" Angela simply replied, "The principal." The words sent a ripple through the room. From the conference glass wall, Harold caught sight of her, frozen in mid-conversation. At first, he didn't move. His brain raced to connect dots it had never imagined belonged together. Then he turned to Gregory. "Is that?" he started. Gregory stood up slowly. "Impossible." Meredith, now peering through the glass, whispered, "That's her. The woman from last week." David, face pale, dropped his pen. "You have got to be kidding." Angela entered the lounge without breaking stride. Her team flanked her like a chess formation, silent, alert, and confident. She scanned the room, recognized the eyes of those who had dismissed her, and offered a nod, professional, unreadable. "Good morning," she said, finally. "Let's get started, shall we?" Not a word was spoken in return. Not yet. The hosts were too stunned, too unsure how to recalibrate their behavior, too aware of the glaring irony tightening around their throats like neckties. As the Altera team moved toward the conference room, Angela placed her portfolio on the center of the polished oak table. the same one where a week ago her ideas had been mocked, and opened it with precision. Her eyes met Harold's across the room. He swallowed. She didn't blink. Angela's presence, though poised and unmistakably self-assured, was still filtered through a lens of arrogance sharpened by years of unchecked bias inside Braylock and Moore's boardroom. As she walked toward the center of the room, her every step echoed against the sleek hardwood floors, confident, even unapologetically controlled. She placed her minimalist black portfolio on the table, not in hesitation, but with a sense of finality, claiming space not as a visitor, but as someone with dominion. Yet still, Harold Lawrence, the managing director, barely glanced at her. Instead, his eyes sought out the two men flanking her, both white, both in similar tailored attire. And without thinking, he gestured subtly toward Angela and muttered under his breath to Gregory, assistant, probably, smart of Altera, to send someone to take notes. Gregory nodded in agreement, not once considering the possibility that the woman commanding the room's energy might also be commanding the capital. We'll wait for their lead investor, Harold added dismissively. No need to get started yet. Angela, hearing every word, remained expressionless. She did not correct him. Not yet. Her team exchanged no glances, gave no cues. They had rehearsed this moment like actors waiting for the right beat to deliver the line that would rupture the narrative. Across the room, Meredith raised an eyebrow, sensing a vague familiarity, but still too steeped in her assumptions to place Angela. The table filled with polite murmurs, shuffled papers, the clink of coffee cups against saucers, until Angela pulled out a chair, took her seat at the head of the table, and opened her folder. Even then, Harold cleared his throat awkwardly and said, "Oh, sweetheart, if you could give these handouts to your team, and perhaps bring a coffee cart while we get things started, we'll make sure you get the minutes after." For a brief moment, silence settled like dust. One of Angela's team members, Marcus, tall, immaculately dressed, a former investment banker, shifted in his seat. But Angela simply glanced up, met Harold's gaze without flinching, and asked in a tone so level it almost stung, "Cream and sugar, or just black?" The question hit the room like a slap in silk gloves. David, sitting 2 seats away, choked slightly on his croissant. Gregory let out a nervous chuckle, clearly unsure whether this was sarcasm or compliance. "Oh, she's got a sense of humor," he said, attempting levity. "That's good. This job can get a little tense." Angela smiled slightly, but said nothing. The kind of nothing that makes men uncomfortable. The kind that holds a mirror to condescension and lets it squirm. Then came the insult that would haunt every member of that room long after the acquisition. Meredith, sipping her espresso, turned toward Angela as if addressing a junior staffer and said with a smirk, "Before we dive into numbers, would you mind printing out 6 extra copies of the deck? We didn't expect such a full house." Angela raised an eyebrow. "You want the deck printed?" she repeated. Meredith nodded. "Yes, please. And make sure the charts are in color. It's hard to tell performance trends in grayscale." Angela's smile remained calm, poised. "Interesting," she said. "I wasn't aware the performance trend was your biggest concern today." Meredith blinked, her expression faltering for the first time. David leaned forward, trying to cut through the tension with fake charm. "You know," he said, addressing Angela like a substitute teacher on her first day, "we appreciate support staff who are this composed. It's rare. You're clearly very good at your job." Before Angela could reply, one of her team members, Olivia, an Ivy League analyst with a memory of a steel trap, cleared her throat. "She is very good at her job," Olivia said coolly. "You'll find out soon enough." Harold clapped his hands once, eager to reset the room. "Let's just get started, shall we?" he said, gesturing to the head of the table, still not realizing that Angela had already claimed that seat. "When your partner from Altera arrives, we can begin the official negotiation. Until then, we'll walk through our quarterly earnings and pipeline development." Angela didn't move. Her fingers tapped softly on the leather folder. Her eyes scanned the room like a general surveying a battlefield, watching each face with the detached curiosity of someone calculating probabilities, not in finance, but in grace. "We can wait," she said simply. "I'm sure your presentation will be enlightening." David, sensing no resistance, stood and wheeled the portable screen into place. Gregory launched into a monologue about market share and innovation strategies, while Meredith passed around a stapled packet that, ironically, was in grayscale. As the presentation unfolded, Angela took notes, not on the numbers, which he had already dissected during diligence, but on the tone, the dismissiveness, the sheer casualness with which they navigated the meeting while believing themselves in control. Halfway through a slide about Q1 expansion into Southeast Asia, Gregory gestured toward Angela's team and said, "Now I assume you'll be bringing along your analyst to manage our international exposure, right? That's assuming you come on board, of course. We still need to see what your managing director says." Then, as if sealing his obliviousness with pride, he turned to Angela and said, "Would you mind getting the door in case the real partner just arrived?" Angela stood. The room paused, unsure whether they had gone too far. She walked to the door, not because she was following instructions, but because her timing demanded a shift. She opened it. No one stood outside. She turned back slowly, walking with the same calm steps she had used the first time she entered Braylock's lobby. This time, though, the silence was different, heavier. Angela placed both palms flat on the table and said clearly, "Perhaps now is the time we clarify a few things." Angela stood at the head of the table with both palms steady on the polished oak surface, her gaze slowly moving from one executive face to the next. The tension in the room was now a living thing, no longer a passive discomfort, but a suffocating weight pressing into every shoulder, especially those still seated, still clinging to the assumption that they were the hosts of this negotiation. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft, controlled, measured, and unflinchingly direct. "I believe it's time we dispense with the confusion," she said, withdrawing a sleek black folder from her leather portfolio and placing it lightly at the center of the table with a precision that silenced even the background hum of the air conditioning. "This," she added, opening the folder with a quiet flick of her fingers, "is the acquisition proposal you received from Altera Capital. Except as of this morning, the proposal has been officially rebranded under its holding company's true identity." She slid the top page forward so the title was fully visible. Bold, centered, and unmistakable. AW Holdings Acquisition Proposal, Braylock and More, controlling interest transaction principal signatory. Angela Williams, CEO and founder. The silence that followed wasn't just stunned, it was paralyzed. Gregory's lips parted slightly, as if sound had been cued but failed to load. Meredith's hand, which had been mid-gesture toward her water glass, hovered in midair, fingers frozen. David leaned forward instinctively, squinting at the header as if his eyes were playing tricks on him. As if this was a prank and any second now someone would burst into the room with a hidden camera crew. Harold Lawrence, the man who had led the charge in brushing off Angela's presence since the moment she walked through their doors, pushed his chair back slightly and opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was Marcus, Angela's chief investment officer, who broke the silence. "I believe what Ms. Williams is saying," he said with smooth clarity, "is that this meeting was never about whether Altera Capital would find Braylock worthy. It was about whether Braylock could earn the confidence of the woman offering to save it." Angela, still standing, added calmly, "You were waiting for your real partner to walk in. I'm standing right here. I've been here, listening, watching, measuring." Her tone didn't need to rise. It didn't need to threaten. The truth did all the cutting. "You mistook leadership for service. You mistook strategy for servitude. And most telling of all, you mistook your assumptions for reality." She then turned to Harold directly. "You wanted a seat at the table. This table is mine." It was only then that the door creaked open and another figure entered. Charlene Brennan, Braylock's head of human resources. Her heels clicked against the floor as she walked in with a bright, oblivious tone. "I apologize for the delay. I was finalizing the candidate roster for next quarter's DI Summit," she said as she walked toward her seat, only to stop mid-stride when her eyes locked on Angela. Her entire expression shifted. Her smile faltered, her color drained. "Oh," she whispered. Angela met her eyes. "Yes, we've met. You interviewed me last week. Or was it more of a performance review?" Charlene's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. I think there may have been a mix-up," she stammered, but Angela cut in, still composed. "There was no mix-up. You were very clear. You said I wasn't the right image, that I lacked executive presence, that I should consider a lateral move into support roles. Your words." Charlene's hands fumbled with her tablet, as if looking down could reverse the moment, erase the past week, reset the power dynamic that was slipping from her grip like sand through fingers. "Ms. Williams," she tried again, her voice trembling slightly. "Please understand we didn't know." Angela stepped forward, just enough for her voice to land with unmistakable impact. "You didn't care to know. That's the difference." Her team said nothing. They didn't have to. The silence now belonged to her. It was no longer awkward, it was powerful. Harold cleared his throat at last, voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "Ms. Williams," he said, his forced smile stretched too tight, "if we had known you were the principal, I assure you, this meeting would have gone very differently." Angela turned to him with the slightest tilt of her head. "And that," she replied, "is exactly why it shouldn't." Gregory, still clutching the proposal in front of him, finally found his voice. This is just, it's surprising is all. You can't blame us for being caught off guard." "You mean," Angela said, folding her hands lightly in front of her, "you can't believe someone who looks like me is capable of owning something that controls you." Her words landed with surgical precision. "That's not what I said," Gregory mumbled. "But it's what you meant," Angela replied, unwavering. "And more importantly, it's how you acted. The actions speak louder than the resume you never bothered to read." Charlene had sunk into her seat now, silent, her fingers clenched around the edge of the table. Her eyes no longer met Angela's. Meredith adjusted her collar and tried to redirect the moment with a nervous smile. "Well, in any case, perhaps we can turn the page. If this acquisition is still on the table, then I'm sure we can come to mutually beneficial terms." "Terms," Angela repeated softly. "Yes, let's talk about terms. But first, let's finish this meeting the way it was always meant to start." She slowly sat down at the head of the table, flipped open her laptop, and connected it to the conference screen. On it flashed the first slide of the transition strategy, AW Holdings Strategic Integration Plan, Phase 1 Executive Realignment. And just beneath that, the subtitle, Rebuilding Culture Starts with Removing the Rot. No one spoke. No one laughed. No one dared ask what executive realignment meant. But each person at that table knew, instinctively, viscerally, that this wasn't just a proposal. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The screen still glowed with the stark clarity of Angela's transition plan as silence hung over the room like a dense fog. But the weight of it was finally broken by Harold Lawrence, whose voice trembled not from fear, but from a desperate need to regain narrative control. "Ms. Williams," he said, trying to sit straighter in his chair, his voice strained into formality. "With all due respect, I have to ask, how does someone your age manage to raise $35 million in capital? Independently, quietly, without even touching a mainstream fund? Who exactly do you work with?" The words weren't meant as pure curiosity. They carried an edge, laced with disbelief, with the implied suspicion that she must have had some unseen benefactor, some secret shortcut. But Angela didn't flinch. She merely smiled, the kind of slow, deliberate smile that spoke of stories untold. "That," she said smoothly, folding her hands in front of her, "is a story for another time." Then she added, eyes gleaming with a promise they couldn't yet decode, "But I promise, it's worth waiting for." And just like that, the room's attention shifted from confusion to curiosity, their powerlessness now compounded by not knowing how they'd been outplayed. Angela didn't answer their question, but she let the mystery hang in the air like a locked vault. And that vault, quietly, began to creak open, not for them, but for us. Because to understand the $35 million, you had to go back to a second-floor apartment in Detroit, 5 years earlier, where Angela Williams sat curled on a beige love seat with cracked leather, a half-drunk cup of gas station coffee beside her, and a laptop balanced on her knees, fingers trembling not from fear, but from resolve. She had just returned from her third investor meeting that month, another room full of men who didn't look at her, only through her, who said her fintech platform for underserved Black entrepreneurs was admirable but not scalable, ambitious but not investment-worthy, and who ended each pitch with a thin smile and a brochure about diversity scholarships that felt like a slap wrapped in a handout. Her phone buzzed beside her. A message from Caleb. "I can't do this anymore, Angie. I love you, but you're chasing ghosts. I need stability. You need to get real." She stared at the screen for a full minute before locking it, standing and tossing it face down on the counter. That was the last time she heard from him. He had wanted her to get a job in compliance at one of the big four firms, had even lined up a referral. But Angela had known deep in the marrow of her bones that what she was building wasn't a ghost. It was a seed, a system, a strategy. And she wasn't chasing dreams. She was engineering a future where people like her didn't have to beg for a seat at the table. That night, she walked to the corner bodega, bought another coffee, and sat back down in front of her laptop. She began refining the code for the first prototype of her algorithm, a decentralized financial literacy tool designed to measure investment readiness in marginalized communities without traditional credit metrics. She didn't pitch it anymore. She deployed it. Over the next 9 months, Angela built a beta community of 1,200 users, mostly small business owners and aspiring entrepreneurs of color, and began to gather data. Real, living data that told a story no investor pitch ever could. By the end of that year, she had created FundBridge, an AI-driven platform that offered microloans, peer-to-peer investing tools, and a shared equity model that allowed successful participants to reinvest in the next wave. She partnered with a cybersecurity friend to encrypt the backend, kept her overhead under $300 a month, and worked from the back of coffee shops and co-working lobbies where no one asked if she had booked a meeting room. In her second year, she quietly launched her own fund, AW Growth Collective. Using $82,000 saved from consulting gigs and early-stage capital gains from crypto arbitrage, she'd learned to master in the late-night hours of economic forums and open-source discords. She didn't tell anyone, not because she was ashamed, but because Angela had learned that power built in silence often holds longer than power broadcasted before it's ready. By year 3, she had generated a 170% return on her first fund cycle. Year 4, she closed her first $5 million acquisition, a failing real estate analytics platform that she repurposed into Equitrace, now the go-to back-end system for her lending arm. She bought the building that once rejected her application to lease a co-working space. She walked past the same desk, greeted the same receptionist who once looked at her like she didn't belong, and now owned the lease to the building's top 3 floors. She never brought it up. She never needed to. Word began to spread in closed networks among equity partners and within blockchain circles that there was a woman, anonymous at first, who was changing the rules of growth. Not by replicating Wall Street, but by outmaneuvering it. She didn't show up on Forbes. She didn't want to. But she showed up in portfolios. She showed up in quarterly reports when executives couldn't explain why their pipeline had dried up, because she had already redirected the current. Angela never forgot the way people looked at her that day at Braylock, the way they laughed, the way they doubted. And so, when she saw their company bleeding innovation, holding aging client portfolios, and leaning on reputation instead of results, she didn't see failure, she saw leverage. The moment the market dipped, she struck. The valuation had dropped just enough. The timing was perfect. She didn't walk into Braylock to prove herself. She walked in to close a deal. But the most powerful move wasn't just that she had the money. It was that no one saw her coming, because no one thought she could. And that was her advantage. That was always the point. Back in the boardroom, her smile lingered just a second longer before she turned her attention back to the screen. "Now," she said, flipping to the next slide, "let's walk through the first 90 days of your transformation plan." But even as she spoke, the room still pulsed with that unanswered question. How did she get here? And no one noticed that Angela had left it hanging on purpose, left it suspended like a weight just above their heads, knowing full well that the truth would land when it needed to. Angela stood at the head of the long table, posture flawless, every movement composed with the grace of someone who had long since made peace with power and now wielded it not to impress, but to correct. As the final slide of her transition deck flickered to black behind her, the silence in the boardroom felt different than the one earlier. This was no longer the silence of confusion or disbelief. It was the silence of inevitability, of people realizing that the world they controlled for years had just shifted beneath their feet. Angela's voice cut through it, not sharp, but resolute, every syllable measured. AW Holdings has officially acquired a 57% controlling stake in Braylock & More, she said, the words falling with the weight of a gavel. Effective immediately, the current board will be dissolved, and a transitional advisory council will be formed over the next 30 days to execute the restructuring strategy. There was a collective exhale around the room, though no one dared breathe too loudly. Harold Lawrence, still pale from the revelation just moments prior, leaned forward, forcing a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're confident the new leadership will ensure the culture remains intact," he said, a weak attempt at grace. Angela turned to him, smile cool. "Culture will change," she said plainly. "That's the point." She let the words settle. Then she continued, "Most of the staff will remain in place. I've spent months quietly assessing performance, culture fit, and potential, not based on resumes, but on resilience, contribution, and vision." A murmur of relief rippled across the junior directors seated near the end of the table. But Angela's next words turned every stomach cold. "However," she said, her tone now unflinching, "there will be select removals. Not for underperformance, but for conduct that contradicts the core values of the new Braylock." She turned her eyes toward Gregory, who shifted in his seat. "Gregory Marks," she said, voice level, "you once said you weren't sure someone like me belonged in your boardroom. Starting today, you no longer belong in mine. Your contract will be terminated, effective immediately." His mouth opened, a protest rising, but he saw something in her eyes that told him resistance was pointless. His jaw shut again. Then she turned to Meredith. "You asked me if I learned to speak the way I do, like it was a performance. Starting today, you're no longer invited to this stage. You're relieved of all duties, effective noon." Meredith's face flushed crimson, but she didn't speak. Not because she didn't want to, but because she had no defense that wouldn't make it worse. Angela's gaze swept the room and landed finally on Charlene Brennan, the head of HR who had once mocked her candidacy without even reviewing her full file. "Charlene," Angela said, and the woman's breath caught in her throat. "You evaluated me not on credentials, but on optics. You assumed my presence was an anomaly. You suggested I consider administrative work, despite a portfolio of innovation and leadership. That was more than poor judgment. That was culture rot. As of this morning, your position no longer exists under this new structure." Charlene sat still, too stunned to move. A tight silence followed until Angela spoke again, this time with a different energy. Less executioner, more architect. But to those who remained silent yet open, who saw discomfort but held composure, who chose professionalism over pride, you will be empowered. We don't rebuild with arrogance. We rebuild with those willing to learn and unlearn. As she closed her laptop, a communications officer from AW Holdings stepped into the room and whispered to her. Angela nodded once. "We're ready." She turned back to the table. The media are waiting. The executives, those who still remained, rose slowly, unsure of whether they were walking into redemption or judgment. But Angela didn't wait for them. She stepped out first, walked past the elevator, and into the glass-walled press room where over 24 reporters and camera crews were now standing by. The podium was centered beneath the Braylock & More emblem, an emblem that, as of this morning, was being subtly rebranded to reflect the integration. The cameras clicked. Microphones leaned forward. Angela stepped up to the microphone, her tailored black suit crisp under the overhead lights, her expression resolute, yet not cold. She took a deep breath, not for nerves, but for purpose, and began. For decades, Braylock & More has stood as a symbol of financial prestige, but also for some, as a gate guarded by legacy over merit, she said, voice clear and steady. Today that changes. Today, this company is no longer defined by who built the walls, but by who breaks them open for others. A wave of camera shutters fired like applause. She continued, effective immediately, we are launching an internal equity audit, a mentorship pipeline for underrepresented leadership, and a reinvestment strategy focused on emerging talent. Our mission moving forward is simple: to ensure that brilliance is no longer filtered through the narrow lens of familiarity, but elevated for its impact, regardless of race, gender, or origin. A murmur of agreement rose from the audience. One reporter stood. Ms. Williams, what do you say to critics who believe you're using this acquisition to settle personal scores? Angela looked directly at the camera. This isn't about revenge. This is about correction. Those who were removed were not punished. They were simply made irrelevant by their own choices. Every company, every culture, reflects the values it tolerates. Braylock tolerated arrogance disguised as excellence. That ends now. Another reporter asked, what's your vision for Braylock in the next 5 years? Angela's eyes sparkled slightly. Transformation, she replied. Not just in numbers, but in narrative. We will become the firm where the future is shaped not by legacy wealth, but by legacy change. As she stepped back from the podium, a standing ovation erupted, not just from a public audience, but from the younger associates of Braylock who had gathered near the back, silent witnesses to history. Angela didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't pose. She simply walked off stage, flanked by her team, as the old guard stared from the wings. Watching the new queen walk through the very gates they once locked to keep her out. The morning after Angela's explosive press conference, media outlets across the country were ablaze with headlines that ranged from celebratory to stunned. From rejected to CEO, Angela Williams rewrites corporate power. Braylock and Moore's new queen breaks the mold, and the silence. The clip of her speech was replayed on news networks, reposted on social platforms, and clipped into TikTok montages by young entrepreneurs who saw in her not just a role model, but proof that justice, though rare, could roar when orchestrated with strategy and patience. On day 3, Angela sat down for a one-on-one interview with Bloomberg Business. The anchor, a seasoned journalist named Vanessa Cruz, greeted her with a smile that was equal parts curiosity and admiration. Angela, thank you for joining us. It's been quite the week, she said, gesturing toward the graphic on screen that read, The Rise of AW Holdings. Angela returned the smile, calm as ever. It has, she said simply, but it's been years in the making. The cameras rolled, the lights cast a soft glow across the studio, and the world leaned in to hear what they had all been wondering. How had a woman so thoroughly underestimated not only turned the tables, but replaced the entire board? Vanessa leaned forward slightly. Let's go back to the beginning, she said. You were publicly dismissed by Braylock just a week before the acquisition. And now, you're sitting here as their new CEO. That's not just poetic, it's surgical. What lit that fire? Angela's answer didn't come instantly. She took a breath, looked slightly to the side as if considering how much to reveal, and then met Vanessa's eyes. Honestly, she began, her voice steady but rich with memory. It was the laughter. Vanessa blinked. The laughter? Angela nodded. That day, when I walked out of the interview, I could hear them laughing. Not just in the room, but behind the walls. I could hear what they thought I couldn't. And that sound, more than any rejection email, more than any funding denial or professional brush-off, was the moment everything crystallized. I realized I didn't want to be accepted by them. I wanted to become someone they could no longer ignore. The audience watching from across the country didn't blink. For many, it was the line they hadn't known they were waiting for. So, Vanessa said, leaning in, you built your empire out of spite. Angela smiled, but her eyes were sharp. No, I built it out of necessity, but I refined it out of clarity. Their dismissal showed me just how broken the gatekeeping still was. So I stopped knocking. Vanessa paused, then asked, was there a moment, a turning point, when things changed? Angela's smile widened. Yes, but they made that moment for me. Then came the twist no one had expected. Do you remember, Angela said, glancing toward the camera, when I said I could hear what they thought I couldn't? Vanessa nodded slowly. I do. Angela reached into her bag and pulled out a thin black flash drive, holding it between two fingers like a secret waiting to be unwrapped. This is a recording, she said, of my interview at Braylock and more. From the moment I sat down to the moment I walked out. Vanessa's eyes widened. You recorded it? I did, Angela confirmed. Legally. I was in a one-party consent state. And I had a reason. Something in my gut told me it wouldn't be just another interview. It would be a case study. Vanessa didn't speak. She didn't need to. Angela continued. I kept the recording to myself for a while. But when AW Holdings began gaining traction and we started attracting small equity investors, I played it for them. Not to manipulate them, but to show them what we were fighting against. The revelation exploded like lightning across the broadcast feed. Angela hadn't just won the game. She had documented the rules being weaponized against her. And when those rules failed, she turned the receipts into a rallying cry. Eventually, Angela said, the recording was shared in a closed investment circle, people who had been dismissed the same way I was. And then someone posted it anonymously. It spread fast. I didn't stop it. Vanessa was visibly stunned. That recording, was it the catalyst? It was the mirror, Angela replied. People heard it and saw themselves. They heard the mockery, the assumptions, the way I was told I didn't look the part. And something shifted. They didn't just invest in me. They invested in justice. The clip of that statement would later go viral on social media, played over music tracks, quoted by educators, and reposted by activists under the hashtag #HeardNotHired. Angela leaned back in her seat, eyes steady. The capital didn't come because I begged for it. It came because I proved that gatekeeping is expensive and outdated. Vanessa, still recovering from the gravity of the flash drive moment, managed to quiet. So you turned a moment of humiliation into a movement. Angela didn't nod. She didn't need to. She just said, I built something no one could take from me, because I started with what they tried to take first, my worth. The final question of the interview came softly, almost hesitant. What would you say to that version of you, the one walking out of Braylock's office that day? Angela's answer was immediate. Keep walking. But listen closely. Their laughter? It's not the end. It's the fuel. The broadcast cut to commercial, but the conversation echoed far beyond the studio walls. In offices across America, women played the recording for themselves and their daughters. In incubators and accelerators, aspiring founders cited Angela's words in pitch decks. And within Braylock itself, junior employees circulated the clip like scripture, whispering that the new leadership wasn't just qualified, it was unstoppable. Angela's voice had gone from muted to magnified. The loop was closed. The very moment they thought had ended her was now the beginning of something much larger. But Angela herself wasn't finished. Not yet. Not with one last name still on her list. The morning after Angela's interview aired, a new kind of storm swept across Braylock and more, not of confusion or restructuring, but of reckoning. Shareholder inboxes flooded with messages from clients, partners, and industry watchdogs who had all heard the now viral audio clip of Angela's original interview. And the names involved weren't just background noise. They were headline material. Harold Lawrence, still clinging to a seat in an advisory capacity while the transitional board was formed, found himself the subject of a furious letter from Braylock's largest legacy investor, Warren Pritchard of Arkenstone Holdings. The subject line read simply, "We need to talk." By noon, Harold was seated in a private video call with 5 major shareholders, all of whom wore identical expressions, disappointment laced with precision. Warren didn't waste time. Your handling of Ms. Williams's candidacy, followed by the global embarrassment that clip has caused, has made you a liability, Harold, he said. It's not just a PR issue. It's brand erosion. It's investor confidence. It's lawsuits waiting to happen. Harold tried to defend himself, voice tight with false composure. We didn't know who she was, he said. She came in as an applicant, not as a buyer. But another shareholder, Amelia Ng from the Hong Kong board, cut in. That's exactly the problem. You didn't care to know. You didn't see the resume because you never looked past the woman. The words landed like judgment. Another shareholder chimed in. And let's be honest, if the recording hadn't leaked, would you have even admitted what you said? Harold opened his mouth, then closed it. Silence again. And this time it was damning. Finally, Warren leaned back, steepling his fingers. You're going to issue your resignation. Today. Quietly, but immediately. You'll release a statement accepting responsibility for a culture that failed under your watch. If you don't, we'll vote to remove you. And when we do, it won't be quiet. An hour later, a company-wide internal memo was released, signed by Harold Lawrence, stating that he would be stepping down to allow new leadership the space to heal and redefine Braylock's mission. It was filled with polished language, but the staff, many of whom had watched Angela's interview and heard the audio, saw through it. They knew, and so did the world. But the resignation was only the beginning. Because while Harold's departure pacified shareholders, it didn't satisfy the public's demand for accountability, especially after a clip surfaced of Charlene Brennan, the former head of HR, making one of her more condescending remarks during Angela's original interview. The line, "Perhaps something more client-facing would be appropriate for your tone," echoed like a slap across every phone screen, laptop, and network broadcast in the country. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. Calls for Charlene to speak publicly grew louder, especially after screenshots emerged showing that she had quietly locked her social media accounts and declined all interview requests. But silence, as it turned out, wasn't just a bad look, it was a catalyst. Public pressure mounted until finally, under advisement from both legal and PR counsel, Charlene agreed to appear on a televised panel discussion hosted by the Business View, a primetime program known for tackling workplace ethics and accountability. The episode aired live. The studio was brightly lit, the tone somber. Charlene sat between two diversity advocates and a former Fortune 500 CEO who had previously resigned under similar allegations of discriminatory practices. Her body language was stiff, her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness, but the cameras were unforgiving. The host, Dana Myers, didn't hold back. "Charlene, millions have heard your words. Many describe them as dismissive, racially coded, and emblematic of systemic exclusion. What do you say to them now?" Charlene swallowed hard. Her voice cracked slightly at first, but she composed herself. "What I said," she began, "was wrong. The way I dismissed Angela's credentials, her tone, and her presence, it wasn't just unprofessional. It was harmful. It reflected a bias I hadn't acknowledged in myself, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Dana pressed further. "Why did you say it? Why did you assume she didn't belong?" Charlene's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "Because I was conditioned to think leadership looked a certain way, and I never questioned that conditioning until it was too late." The apology went viral within hours. Clips of her statement were reposted under captions like "too little, too late," and "corporate bias exposed" on live TV. But to many, the moment represented something rare, not just humiliation, but reflection. And, perhaps, the start of a broader conversation. Angela, when asked later if she had seen the apology, simply replied, "I saw it. I heard her. Whether she changes, that's up to her. I'm not here to punish. I'm here to rebuild." But the impact didn't stop there. Within 2 days, over 50 major corporations initiated internal audits. Hashtags like #CheckYourBias and #AngelaEffect trended for a full week. College campuses held panels dissecting the power of her response. Venture funds began pledging capital toward founders who had been historically overlooked, citing Angela's model as a new benchmark. For the first time in decades, the corporate world was not only witnessing a shift, but participating in it, not from fear, but from awakening. Inside Braylock's headquarters, offices that once echoed with exclusionary silence now buzzed with reform. Departments were being restructured, mentorship programs launched, and a listening tour led by Angela herself scheduled to hear directly from employees across every level. No more layers. No more invisible walls. When Angela walked into the HR wing, newly renamed the People and Equity Division, she noticed the framed mission statement being updated in real time. We lead by seeing. We grow by listening." She nodded slightly, then turned the corner, heading toward a quiet room where one last meeting was waiting for her. The small conference room at the far end of the newly rebranded Braylock Tower was simple. White walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, a single long table with no nameplates, no hierarchy. Angela preferred it that way. In the wake of sweeping changes and viral media waves, she had requested this final debrief with Harold Lawrence, once the gatekeeper of everything she was told she'd never earn, to take place without cameras, without press, just the two of them and the silence of consequence. When Harold entered, noticeably thinner, eyes lined with the fatigue of public fallout, he didn't speak right away. Angela motioned to the chair across from her. He sat, exhaled, and met her gaze. "I've submitted the paperwork," he said quietly. "I've divested fully. I'm no longer affiliated with the company in any capacity." Angela nodded, her expression unreadable. "That's the easy part," she said. "What about the rest?" Harold hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and slid a small folder across the table. Inside was an outline, his application to join the Bridge, a non-profit accelerator for minority-led startups that Angela herself had funded quietly 2 years ago. He looked down, then said, "I know I'll never undo the damage, but I'd like to try building something better, even if no one ever thanks me for it." Angela studied him for a long moment. "You want to help entrepreneurs you once ignored?" He nodded. "Yes, and not from the stage. From the back. Quietly. I don't want to be seen. I want to serve." It wasn't an apology. It was a decision. A choice to rebuild with no guarantee of redemption. And that, Angela knew, was where real change started. She slid the folder back to him. "Then start with listening," she said. "And this time don't interrupt." 3 months passed, and the Bridge welcomed Harold not as a mentor, but as a silent partner in their resource development team. He never asked to speak at panels. He took notes during every founder pitch. He learned to sit with discomfort, to unpack unconscious bias not through self-defense, but through quiet observation. And when a young black founder named Jana Carter pitched a business model nearly identical to the one Angela had been dismissed for years earlier, Harold was the first to raise his hand, not with a challenge, but with support. "This is what the industry needs," he said simply. No headlines, no fanfare, just the slow work of transformation. Meanwhile, across the city, Angela was preparing for Women of Color in Leadership, the annual summit she had launched the year before as a quiet celebration of resilience, brilliance, and untold power. This year's event was different, larger, more public. The viral events of Braylock's acquisition had placed her at the center of a cultural conversation she hadn't asked for but had embraced. Speakers included founders, scientists, state senators, and for the first time, Angela planned to close the event with something unexpected, an invitation to someone whose presence would raise eyebrows and perhaps discomfort, but, she believed, could demonstrate what no press release ever could. On the night of the summit, the ballroom was filled with over 600 guests. The stage, lit in soft gold, bore no banners, no sponsor logos, only a single phrase projected across the backdrop. "Visibility is not power. Ownership is." Angela stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause, but her tone was measured, intimate. "Tonight," she began, "we celebrate women who refuse to be defined by anyone else's ceiling. But more importantly, we honor the journey it takes, not just to rise, but to confront, to unlearn, and to rebuild." Then, to a room holding its collective breath, she added, "Tonight, I'd like to introduce someone who once saw me not as a peer, but as an outsider. Someone who said words that echoed a system too many of us know too well. But tonight, she's not here to be judged. She's here because change doesn't begin with applause. It begins with courage." Gasps swept through the room as Angela extended her hand, and Charlene Brennan, once HR gatekeeper, now public symbol of bias turned ally, stepped onto the stage. She looked different, not in attire, but in energy, humbled, human. Angela turned to her, not with scorn, but with clarity. "Charlene," she said into the mic, "do you remember what you said to me in that interview room?" Charlene nodded, her voice small but audible. "Yes. I told you, you weren't the image we had in mind." Angela nodded. And tonight, what would you say to this room of leaders? Charlene turned to face the crowd. That I was wrong. That image is a prison we build when we forget to see people. And that the only way forward is to face the past without flinching. There was no applause at first, only stillness, heavy and sacred. Then someone in the back stood. Then another. Soon, the room was on its feet, not cheering for Charlene, but for the idea that healing, though painful, was possible. Angela stepped forward, took Charlene's hand, not to crown her, but to welcome her into the work. Later that night, in an after-event circle where emerging founders shared their visions, Angela stood quietly at the back, listening as a young woman described her dream to build an app for youth mental health in underfunded communities. Angela didn't interrupt. She didn't correct. She simply smiled, because now the doors were open, and more importantly, now they knew how to walk through them themselves. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice about power, bias, and redemption, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories that challenge the system and celebrate transformation. What was the moment that hit you the hardest? Was it the interview recording? The press conference? Or when Angela offered a hand instead of a grudge? And just before you go, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Let's build a community where these stories aren't fiction, they're the future.